The ancient Indian texts mention beautifully decorated chariots or entire palaces called Vimanas that could take off and, in a matter of seconds, fly away as far as space. Some people believe these Vimanas only existed in Indian mythology, but it's also possible that they were based on a real technology that had been lost over the centuries. According to the Vedas, ancient Indian religious texts, there was the elephant Vimana with several engines and many other types named after animals and birds. There was one for local travel, one for visiting different countries, and one for traveling to the moon and various planets. They could develop a great speed. One Vimana had the superpower of invisibility. Another one was shaped like a sphere and was built on the winds produced by Mercury. This Vimana was said to generate an enormous ray like the sun and make noise like the storm's thunder. All the Vimanas were unbreakable and perfect for attacks on foes. Now, to operate a Vimana, you'd need to know a lot of stuff, pretty much like today's airplane pilots, 32 secrets in total. They'd cover the aircraft structure and the secrets of taking off and maneuvering without crashing. That's a good thing. The pilot was also expected to know how to be seen and unseen, how to be hidden, how to be quick, how to manage contractions and expansion, and many other tricks. To hide the flying machine from foes, the pilot was instructed to move to the 8th atmospheric layer above the Earth and use the power of dark solar rays. This instruction might sound a bit weird, but there were others, more realistic ones, which still make sense in modern aeronautics. There are sections of ancient texts on the Vimanas that focus on details like flight paths, pilot training, navigation, and even suitable clothes for pilots and recommended food for long flights. There was also a lot of technical detail about the use of heat-absorbing metals, the metals utilized, and melting points. The supporters of the theory that the Vimanas were more than just myths are sure that the ancient Indians would unlikely go into all these details just for a beautiful story. So, the flying palaces might have been real and way ahead of their time, like many other great Indian inventions. Back in the 6th century BCE, an Indian physician named Sushruta basically wrote the original guide to medicine and surgery. They even called him the father of surgery for his work. Sushruta laid down the details on hundreds of medicinal plants and described complex surgical procedures. He gave instructions on nose reconstructions and skin transplants from one part of the body to another. The original method of rhinoplasty, which involved taking a piece of skin from the forehead to reconstruct the nose, is still used today. But back then, it had a slightly different purpose than surprising your followers on social media. Those nose jobs helped out folks who had lost their noses as punishment for crimes or in fights. Now, you gotta thank an ancient Indian math prodigy for the invention of zero. It might not seem like a big deal, but without it, we would have no binary system and no computers. People before the 5th century CE were only thinking about some sort of a sign to indicate nothing. The invention made addition, subtraction, and other mathematical operations a whole lot easier. You can see the oldest zero in existence carved in the wall of a temple in Gwalior, India. The Indus Valley Civilization was using rulers in 1500 BCE and earlier. Made from ivory, these rulers were found during excavations in what is present-day Pakistan and northwestern India. They were widely used in architecture with amazing accuracy. They had units corresponding to slightly over 1 inch that were marked with precise subdivisions within 5/1000ths of an inch. The next invention is more of a concept than a physical item. Standardization is all about setting the rules based on a bunch of people, things, or interests. One of its cool applications that we've all gotten used to is standard weights. Whether you're using pounds or kilograms, you need these universal measurements for weight, right? For this, we owe a big shout-out to the merchants from the Indus Valley Civilization who lived around 4,000 years ago. They were measuring everything from food grains to fancy luxury goods using these standardized weights. And their weights had decimal and binary mathematical systems going on. They didn't have high-tech gear. but they pulled off some serious precision using complex calculations and even sand for construction. Their art of standardization made its way to Persia and Central Asia, basically becoming the global weight-watching standard. So if yoga is your go-to exercise, you definitely have a personal reason to appreciate the ancient Indian geniuses. Over 5,000 years ago, during the rule of the Indus Sarasvati civilization in northern India, yoga was first mentioned in the Vedas. Yoga was refined and shaped over the centuries until it grew into a massive teaching with over 200 sacred writings dedicated to this way of obtaining enlightenment. At the beginning of the current era, yoga got a new trajectory thanks to a Hindu writer who laid down a system of yoga in his text, the Yoga Sutras. It became a whole-body rejuvenation, a life-extending practice with poses that you are still doing on the mat today. Yoga has reached the Western world only in the 19th century, and it caught on like wildfire. Chess, the all-time top game for intellectuals, is also an Indian invention. Its ancestor was called Chaturanga, and it was a strategic board game that started gaining popularity around 3,000 years before the current era. This early Indian version of chess was played by 4 people, not 2, and had 64 squares. Each player had 8 pieces, ranging from pawns to kings, bishops to knights, and there was no standard 6-faced dice. They rolled with an oblong one. Players facing off were actually allies, forming 2 teams based on the direction they sat. Chess, that we know and love today, was first mentioned in ancient Indian literature in a legend. It said that the wife of a villain called Ravana had invented the game to amuse him. Now, the word shampoo comes from the Hindi word, which means to soothe or knead. The substance was invented in India in 1762 and was originally used for head massages, hence the name. The first shampoo was made of natural oils and herbs. British traders fell in love with the idea and brought it back with them to England. It took years for the original head massage oil to evolve into shampoo as we know it today, but it's still an Indian invention. Unlike the ancient Greeks, who wore animal skins, the Indians started cultivating cotton back in the 5th and 4th centuries before the current era. They used cotton threads to produce fabrics that soon became a huge hit in the Mediterranean and beyond. Jute and wool also have their origins in India. Cashmere, the finest and most exclusive type of wool, actually comes from the Kashmir region of India. Buttons that sit proudly on that cashmere cardigan of yours also have ancient Indian origins. Some 5,000 years ago, the Indus Valley civilization started cutting seashells into geometric shapes with tiny holes in them. First, they were just decorations, but then people started using them to fasten clothes. Now, when you think about radio communication pioneers, Marconi's name usually steals the spotlight. He got a Nobel Prize in Physics in 1909 for his groundbreaking radio work. But there's an unsung hero in the radio waves game, and his name is Sir Jagdish Chandra Bose. He spilled the beans on radio communication way back in 1895. He shot an electromagnetic wave across 75 feet at the town hall in Calcutta, and it went through walls, rang a bell, and even set off some gunpowder. Marconi took a page from Bose's book, using his invention, the Mercury Coherer, as a blueprint for his own two-way radio. Bose didn't patent his genius creation, so he only got his credit a century later.
In the middle of the previous century, flying saucers were constantly making headlines. America was going through a surge of reported UFO sightings. So it shouldn't probably come as a surprise that the American authorities, namely the U.S. Air Force, created a couple of short-lived programs. Those were Project Sign and Project Grudge, and their main goal was to look into that phenomenon. These programs were followed by likely the most famous of them all, Project Blue Book. It was a large-scale government study that lasted from 1951 to 1969. The initiator of this program was Major General Charles P. Cabell. He was a former intelligence director of the Air Force. Project Blue Book scrupulously gathered over 12,600 reports about people seeing bizarre, unidentified objects in the sky. After thorough research, it was determined that most of those had natural, quite mundane explanations. As for the rest of the reports, the members of Project Blue Book simply didn't have enough data to evaluate them. That's why support for their efforts dwindled. Officially, Project Blue Book was closed in December 1969. But apparently, it didn't make American authorities lose interest in UFO sightings. Because in mid-December 2017, the world found out that they had secretly launched one more UFO research program in the late 2000s. Accordingly to certain documents, American authorities spent around $22 million over a 4-year span on a project called the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, aka AATIP. This project was started in 2007, and its main goal was to study UFO phenomena. Most likely, all this activity was triggered by the 2004 Tic Tac incident. That's when a few U.S. Air Force pilots spotted unidentified flying objects off the coast of California. They captured them on video. None of the pilots could figure out what these objects were. They behaved in a weird way, as if our laws of physics didn't apply to them. They were reportedly flying extremely fast and rotating in unpredictable movements. It looks as if after that incident, American authorities decided to investigate whether those objects could be identified or not. And if not, they were eager to know where they had come from and if they had been a threat. When the New York Times story about the new project broke, officials announced that the study had been terminated in 2012. However, there were people who claimed that the program was still ongoing. One of those was a military intelligence official running the program until they quit in October 2016. In any case, let's have a closer look at this mysterious program. Indeed, the areas of research funded by the project resembled things you could find in Star Trek. For example, one grant was for the study of traversable wormholes, stargates, and negative energy. This study was conducted by Eric W. Davis of EarthTech International, Inc. Another grant sponsored the research of invisibility cloaking. One more area of study included warp drive, dark energy, and the manipulation of extra dimensions. This research was conducted by a theoretical physicist and director of the nonprofit Icarus Interstellar. As we've already mentioned, all these studies received at least $22 million of funding, but this sum could have been much bigger. No one has revealed why or how these studies were given such huge grants under the AATI program. The results of the study aren't known publicly either. The criteria for choosing these fields of research could be that warp drives and stargates might be useful for extraterrestrial civilizations traveling interstellar distances to visit our planet. Still, some people are not amused that such questionable fields of study were receiving substantial government funding. One of the best and most convincing pieces of evidence that extraterrestrial civilizations have visited Earth could be the epic Nuremberg space battle of April the 4th, 1561. It was recorded either in 1561 or 1566. Different sources provide different information. All the retellings of this story focus on the woodcut picture and a vague summary of events that occurred that day. The emphasis is always on crashed spaceships and space battles. Almost everywhere you read or hear the story, it goes like this. The inhabitants of the city woke up early on an April morning and saw a staggering celestial show that looked like a real space battle. This story sounds even more convincing when you find out that some objects allegedly fought for quite a while. And some even crashed. You can see them in the lower right corner. Look at the picture once again. Orbs and crosses fighting, a giant arrow and bizarre tubes, crashing ships. Wow, that had to be a spectacular cosmic battle. To make it all more plausible, Hans Glaser, the artist behind the woodcut, was a very real person. He really did woodcuts, and this one is indeed from the time and place that it says it is, meaning it's not fake, and it does depict a real event that had its own witnesses. For all intents and purposes, it looks like very convincing proof of aliens visiting us. But don't get your hopes up. A superficial perusal of facts seems to confirm an extraterrestrial presence on our planet. But the most likely explanation is much more mundane. The Nuremberg 1561 UFO battle is just an atmospheric phenomenon called a sundog, or parhelion. A sundog is a concentrated spot of sunlight that can sometimes be seen to the right or to the left of the sun, or even on its both sides simultaneously. Sundogs often appear as a pair of patches of light with subtle colors at the same altitude over the horizon as the sun. They can have a variety of forms, from colorful spots to patches of light so intense and bright, it looks like there are two additional suns in the sky. Sundogs are weird looking enough to make it seem that something scary and otherworldly is going on in the sky. At the same time, it's just our planet's atmosphere or ice in the upper parts of the sky acting as a prism or reflective device. This prism makes the light from the sun or moon do weird things. This image can help you visualize the phenomenon. Apparently, Nuremberg had the perfect conditions for this phenomenon to occur. If you examine the depiction of this event and compare it with modern pictures and videos, you'll soon realize that a sundog is indeed a more likely explanation than the Galactic Empire paying us a visit. Let's find the proof of this statement in the translated description of these events and in the woodcut picture itself. First, the sun showed and was seen with two blood-colored half-round strokes, like the diminishing moon right through the sun, and in the sun, above, under, and on both sides, stood blood-colored and partly bluish, or iron-colored, also black-colored round orbs. Now here's the photo of a sundog. It has a halo surrounding it, and a red orb. And if we have at least one red orb, there could be others showing up during other events. Plus, keep in mind that sundogs are like prisms. So, depending on how light is reflected, there could be multiple colors present during such a phenomenon. Now, referring to circled plates mentioned in the description, those could be halos. For example, this sun halo looks vaguely plate-like, and it seems to be linked to other sun halos. And indeed, people have seen halos with multiple orbs. Some of the orbs could have taken a cross-like shape. If we watch some modern videos of sundogs, we might notice that the orbs on film are sun-colored. But since the Nuremberg event happened between 4 and 5 a.m., the clouds and the sun could have had reddish and orange hues. As for the fighting, it could be as simple as one shape moving a bit and changing shape along with the movements of the sun. It could have looked as if it was pushing the other shapes out of the way. Do you agree with the scientific explanation? Or do you prefer to think that Earth was visited by guests from a galaxy far, far away? Write your opinion in the comments.
An ancient structure, the largest of its kind, is standing silent and ominous in the Egyptian desert. What if this pyramid, the Pyramid of Cheops, isn't just an ancient tomb? What if it's the colossal foundation of a long-lost technology far beyond our understanding, built as part of an ancient space elevator? A space elevator sounds like something out of a futuristic sci-fi movie. It's a massive cable anchored to Earth and going all the way up to the stars, allowing travel to and from space without rockets. What if someone managed to build it millennia before us? Let's start with the pyramid itself. The Pyramid of Cheops isn't just any pyramid. It's the heaviest and most precise of all the pyramids on our planet. Historians believe it's around 4,500 years old. But there's an opinion that it might be much, much older. Some claim that there's evidence supporting this theory, but it has been dismissed by Egyptologists. Probably because it doesn't fit the established story, or because the implications are too world-shaking. Now, look at the pyramid structure, at these huge blocks stacked with laser-like precision, aligned to true north, rising up in a sharp, stable form. Inside, there are only a few narrow, sloping corridors and a small number of rooms. The corridors don't even make sense for human movement. They're narrow, angular, probably designed to accommodate something else, something functional. The passages themselves look more like maintenance tunnels than ceremonial spaces. They don't even run horizontally, slanting inward and downward as if carrying some hidden purpose. There are also diagonal channels running from the edges toward the center, their purpose unknown. lubrication channels, or pressure tunnels. And then there's the main room, situated close to the pyramid's heart, but not right in the center. Why? Now look at this bizarre vertical shaft at the very top, piercing downward toward the center. Around the pyramid, there's rust, thousands of tons of it. What if it's the remnants of a technological complex? An ancient spaceport decayed into dust and debris millennia ago? Could the rooms have been technical chambers for maintaining the impossible? A cable that stretched all the way into space? Then the corridors and channels could have been used to stabilize, fasten, or even power this mysterious device. Historians insist these pyramids were tombs or ritual sites. At the same time, when archaeologists can't explain an ancient structure, they often default to religious use. The truth may be far more practical and shocking. The pyramid could have served as the base of an immense, stabilizing structure designed to extend a cable toward space. An ancient civilization could have built it to efficiently transport massive loads into orbit. A space elevator would have been efficient and economical and could have supported an advanced society's need for regular, dependable access to the sky. The pyramid's mass is beyond belief, and it might not be an accident. To anchor something like a space elevator, a structure would need to resist the pull of a cable stretching thousands of miles into orbit. It would need to balance centrifugal force with monumental gravity, and this colossal stone pyramid could have been that counterweight. And the pyramid's inner rooms, corridors, and channels might have served specific technical purposes. Next to the Pyramid of Cheops, there's the slightly smaller Pyramid of Khafra. It has similar diagonal corridors, similar central rooms, and the same purposeful alignment. Could it have been a version 1 space elevator? A prototype of the technology used in Cheops? Like old runways left abandoned at an airport, Khafra could be the first draft of something far grander. You might ask, why would anyone need such a colossal structure in the ancient past? Well, because the further you advance, the more you seek efficiency. A space elevator is the ultimate economical solution for transporting huge amounts of cargo to and from orbit. It's the dream of modern engineers, and maybe it was the achievement of an ancient society. We barely know who lived on Earth 10,000 years ago, let alone what technology they might have wielded. What if there was once a civilization advanced enough to build such an elevator? They may not have been human altogether. Maybe they were visitors. Perhaps they were Earth-based. We might never find the answers to this mystery. One of the greatest mysteries in human history is probably the origins of the Great Pyramid of Giza. This massive, awe-inspiring structure has been puzzling pretty much everyone for thousands of years. How did ancient engineers, without modern tools or machines, manage to pull off something so jaw-droppingly monumental? Could it be that they had a bit of extraterrestrial help? We'll dwell on this theory a bit later, but first, how about one of the more tradiatonal explanations? It claims that ancient workers could have built massive ramps to haul giant stones up to the pyramid's higher levels. It sounds reasonable until you find out that there's barely any archaeological evidence for these ramps. Sure, smaller ramps might have been used, but huge, miles-long ramps? Not likely. And even if they had existed, they would have been an enormous feat in themselves, since the builders would have needed almost as much material for the ramp as for the pyramid itself. This is where things get interesting. Since the ramp theory doesn't fully hold up, we're left with an even bigger mystery. How did the Egyptians move millions of multi-ton stones with such precision? Well, some people point to extraterrestrial visitors. The idea that aliens might have been behind the construction of the pyramids has existed for decades. According to this theory, the pyramids were just too advanced for humans to have built on their own. The precision of the architecture, the sheer scale of the project, and the mysterious mathematical principles at play have made many people believe that some outside force must have lent a hand. One of the biggest arguments the supporters of this theory have is that building something as perfect as the Great Pyramid would have required a bird's eye view. And who could have had that view? Certainly not humans, but maybe a spaceship. Aliens could have hovered above, guiding the construction. If you thought things couldn't get any more mysterious, let's talk about the golden ratio. A mathematical principle you can meet everywhere in nature, from seashells to galaxies. And the Great Pyramid's proportions seem to align almost perfectly with the golden ratio. Alien theorists point to this as evidence that the Egyptians couldn't have pulled this off without some extraterrestrial help. Some people even went so far as to claim that alien remains had been found inside the Great Pyramid. But before you get too excited, keep in mind that there's no solid evidence to back this up. And still, let's take a closer look inside the Great Pyramid. If the exterior is impressive, the interior is downright mind-blowing. It's a labyrinth of tunnels, shafts, and chambers so complex that it's no wonder people have speculated about alien involvement. How could ancient humans have designed something so intricate and mysterious? Some believers say this is further proof that the pyramids were more than just tombs. They were either built or influenced by some kind of divine or extraterrestrial intelligence. And now, let's get into one of the wildest ideas. What if the pyramids were built to align with the stars or even act as part of an ancient space elevator? Some theorists suggest that the pyramids were aligned with certain constellations and served as landing sites for alien spacecraft. Come to think about it, the site indeed sounds like a cosmic airport. All those sharp angles, the perfect geometry, the precise alignment with the stars. Others go even further, proposing that the pyramids were part of a long-lost spacefaring technology. They could have been used to harness energy from stars or served as gateways between worlds. So, are the pyramids really ancient alien landing sites? Were they part of a cosmic energy grid? So far, there's no scientific proof to support these ideas. The Great Pyramid, with all its secrets and unanswered questions, continues to captivate everyone's attention. It's a reminder that there are still things in this world, and maybe beyond it, that we just don't fully understand.
Hi everyone! Today we'll be talking about the controversial music that astronauts once heard in space. A few years ago, NASA made public the recording of a bizarre music that the astronomers from Apollo 10 reported hearing in May 1969, while they were flying over the far side of the moon. At that moment, they were out of radio contact with Earth. This happened months before the first astronaut set foot on the lunar surface. There were 3 people on board: Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan. The sounds lasted for about an hour. Astronomers managed to record them and transmit them to Mission Control in Houston. Now, I want you to listen to these whistling sounds.
That music even sounds outer spacey, doesn't it? You hear that? That whistling sound? Woo!
Don't they resemble some kind of otherworldly outer space music? So the question is, could the astronauts have heard alien music coming from outer space? Well, there's another more simple, non-alien involving explanation for this cosmic phenomenon, but we'll talk about it a bit later. In the audio recording from the Apollo 10 mission, astronaut Eugene Cernan, who was piloting the lunar module, could be heard asking John Young, piloting the command module, if he could hear that whistling sound. Cernan was the first one to call these sounds music and to add that they were kinda outer spacey. Later, when the 2 astronauts asked Tom Stafford, who was in the lunar module with Cernan, if he could hear the sounds too, he confirmed it and stated that they were really weird. Young suggested they should find out more about them. "Nobody will believe us," he added. Apollo 10 was a mission that paved the way for Apollo 11, which landed 2 humans on the lunar surface. The Apollo 10 astronauts flew to the moon in a command module. However, 2 of the crew members also had a ride in the lunar module, which allowed them to drop down to less than 10 miles above the moon's surface. So, since they managed to approach our natural satellite so closely, could they have heard something coming from the lunar surface? Well, apparently not. Turns out that the creepy whistling sound was nothing more than some interference between the VHF radios on the 2 different vehicles. Interestingly enough, Apollo 11 astronaut Michael Collins later wrote in his book, Carrying the Fire, that NASA technicians had warned him about the whistling. He also mentioned that if he hadn't known about the origins of this music, it would have scared him to no end. In 2008, NASA shared the transcripts of the Apollo 10 transmission, but according to the documents themselves, they were declassified in 1982. In 2012, NASA also shared the audio files online. If you listen to these files, you'll hear that the astronauts sound sincerely awed and puzzled by what they hear. Moreover, they bring it up over and over again. It's also worth mentioning that you never actually feel that the 3 men were panicked or alarmed while going over the transcript or the audio. Some sources put particular emphasis on the fact that the space music started when the astronauts were over the far side of the moon. They didn't have radio or visual contact with Mission Control for about an hour, something that had been expected. Some documentaries used this moment to create tension by saying things like, the astronauts were on their own. No one on Earth could see or hear them. However, the narrators never explained why the astronauts' isolation could have been such a significant factor. By no means was it connected to the not-so-mysterious sounds and their source. There's another interesting element to this story that we should consider though, and it's the fact that Apollo 10 astronauts never discussed this incident and these sounds publicly. However, it's still unclear whether they talked about it with NASA engineers. This makes some people speculate that the astronauts didn't want to project anything but a rock-hard psyche. Showing a drop of confidence even once during the whole mission could have left them out of the whole project. Hi, my name is Martin. I am the author of this channel, and today I'll tell you all about the evidence of astronauts meeting with unidentified things at the time of observation. It's the year 1962, and American John Glenn is orbiting Earth in his Friendship 7 capsule on the Mercury Atlas 6 flight. He looks out of the window and sees fireflies.
Well, maybe those are not fireflies, but he clearly sees some weird bright specks clustered around the ship. Unsurprisingly, he tries to find a logical explanation. Can they be ice crystals from the spacecraft's hydrogen peroxide attitude control rockets? But Glenn is unable to correlate their appearance with the use of the rockets. The mystery remains unsolved.
Only much later will we find out what those fireflies were. You see, spaceships tend to accumulate clouds of debris and contamination around themselves. And when Glenn's rockets sprayed jets of crystals, many of these crystals accumulated in the cloud. They reflected sunlight and interacted with other gases, looking like tiny sparkles. The case of the mysterious fireflies is now officially solved.
But it isn't the darkest space tale. One of the most famous cases of seeing bizarre stuff in space comes from Apollo 11. That's when Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins noticed a UFO pacing along with them during their flight to the moon. That's how the astronauts described this incident. We did watch a slow blinking light some substantial distance away from us. There was something out there, close enough to be observed. The period of uncertainty was rather brief. The astronauts and ground control soon identified the object. It was one of the 4 adapter panels that fit between the 3rd stage and the lunar module. These panels were ejected from the 3rd stage, and one of them continued along the same trajectory as the lunar module with the crew. While moving, it rotated and blinked when sunlight was reflected off its surface.
Another famous and truly creepy picture hinting at the presence of alien life on the moon was taken by the crew of Apollo 16.
As the astronauts were leaving our natural satellite, they made a video, and 4 seconds of it showed a near-perfect Hollywood flying saucer leaving behind a plasma trail. For more than 30 years, enthusiasts used this video to prove that aliens had paid us a visit.
But then, scientists decided to take the matter into their own hands. They realized that, when viewed from the window through which the video had been taken, the object in the film was actually consistent with a small floodlight sticking out from the side of the capsule on a boom.
Look, from this angle, the floodlight looks exactly like a flying saucer. And the boom, indeed, looks like that plasma trail. And do you see this? Those are a couple of bolts on the boom.
Another report that inspired UFO enthusiasts came from Gemini 7. Astronauts Frank Borman and Jim Lovell were making what was called a football maneuver. It was supposed to get them into a position where they would make recurring close approaches with their Titan II booster stage every orbit.
But when they were performing this maneuver, Barman reported bogey at 10 o'clock high. We have several, looks like debris, up here, actual sighting. We also have the booster in sight. Yeah, have very, very many. Look like hundreds of little particles banked on the left out about 3 to 4 miles. It looks like a path to the vehicle at 90 degrees. They are past now. They were in polar orbit. Lovell claimed that the booster was in sight too, slowly tumbling along with the debris cloud. Does it mean that Bogman's bogey particles couldn't have been the booster or booster debris? After all, they were moving in a different direction, traveling along a different trajectory. Well, not necessarily. Later analysis showed that those particles were ice flakes from leftover fuel from the Titan II.
As you see, astronauts often report seeing weird stuff out there, but NASA's reaction is often anticlimactic. Let's have a look at how they commented on the statements of an astronaut who claimed to have witnessed alien presence in space.
NASA doesn't track UFOs. NASA is not involved in any sort of cover-up of alien life on this planet or anywhere else in the universe.
We should also remember that unidentify doesn't necessarily mean positively identify as an alien spacecraft. There's a lot of objects in orbit, and a lot of stuff travels along every mission. So, we'll always have UFO reports as long as we have space programs.
Imagine simultaneously being born, growing up, and getting old somewhere out there in the universe. Sounds bizarre and unrealistic. And still, according to the block universe model of the world, that's exactly what happens with you, me, and other living beings on our planet. It's as if someone drew pictures about every moment of your life and then just piled them one on top of another, creating a giant block of all things that ever happen at any time and at any place. The future, present, and past exist at the same time and are equally real. The block has 4 dimensions. 3 of them are spatial. It's length, width, and height. There's one more, time. To make it easier, let's picture our world as a cuboid, which is basically a 3-dimensional rectangle. Its height and width represent 2 of the 3 spatial dimensions of the universe. As for the 3rd spatial dimension, we'll replace it with time. At one end of the cuboid, we'll drop the Big Bang. And at the other, there will be the end of the universe. Let it be a big crunch. Our cuboid is filled with every single event that ever happens. Even this moment, when you're watching this video, exists somewhere in the block. Now, we perceive today as the present, yesterday as the past, and tomorrow as the future. From this perspective, it seems that time passes. But in the block universe, time doesn't flow. There's no specific present moment since the notions of the past and future are relative. You see, we are always located wherever we are, which means that everyone remains in the present. But the block universe theory doesn't deny the notions of earlier than and later than. These relations remain no matter what and regardless of where anyone is located. For example, Molly the mammoth is located earlier than Marcus the tiger. This relation between Molly and Marcus will remain unchanged regardless of whether you're located later than Marcus or earlier than Molly. This way, in the block universe, now is any time you are located at. Past is any time or events that are earlier than your location, and future is any time or events that are later than your location. It sounds like in the block universe, we could travel in time since it's just another dimension. Well, it could be true, but of course, things just have to be more complicated than that. Traveling in time is way more difficult than traveling in space, but it's not impossible if you travel very, very fast. Traveling at extremely high speeds results in time dilation. We can travel into the future at a reasonable percentage of the speed of light, and to get to the past, we can use wormholes, shortcuts through space-time. But if we can travel in time in the block universe, can we change the past? Not really, because if you do, it'll create a contradiction. Keep in mind that, in this universe, the past is the same as the present or the future. What is past to you is future to someone else. And when traveling to the past, you're going to someone else's future. In the past, you'll act just like you do in the present, but you won't be changing the past. All your actions are already predetermined in the block universe. At the moment of the Big Bang, it's already clear that at one point, you'll travel to the relative past. Just like what you do tomorrow makes tomorrow the way it is and has always been, what you do in the past makes it the way it is and has always been. The events in the block universe do not change. As a time traveler, you don't suddenly appear in the past. It's always been the case that you're located in the past. And nothing a time traveler does can change anything in the block. Instead, whatever you do at any time makes that time the way it is. Seen a good horror movie lately? If you're a fan of those, then you can appreciate a good plot. But what if I told you that Mother Nature is the best scriptwriter ever? Ancient disasters were scarier than any horror movie today. From tsunamis to volcanic eruptions, you'll be shocked by the scale of these events. One natural disaster you definitely don't want to experience is a tsunami. Those gigantic walls of water sweep across the coast and take out everything in their way. And it's nothing new for our planet. Scientists were able to piece together a timeline based on evidence that major tsunamis left. In northern Chile, a large boulder sits high above the Pacific Ocean. Behind it, a desert as far as the eye can see. This 44-ton stone obviously doesn't belong here. It's the result of an ancient tsunami. Waves as high as a 6-story building carried boulders like pebbles. Researchers estimate this happened in 1420. But how can they possibly know this? In the 15th century, there were no written records in the region. Time for some detective work. Archaeologists discovered that around the same time, there was a tsunami in Japan, on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. The ground shook off the coast of Chile. That's how the tsunami was created. Then the wave traveled nearly 2/5 of the Earth's circumference. That's one tireless tsunami. But this wasn't a one-time event. Evidence suggests that a similar event happened 3,800 years ago. Ancient people abandoned their coastal villages around this time. They were moving inland. How did they know it was time to go? There's evidence of erosion due to strong currents, telltale signs of an ancient tsunami. As you know from school textbooks, oxygen is 21% of the air we breathe, but it wasn't always a part of Earth's atmosphere. Oxygen was missing during the first half of our planet's lifespan. Carbon dioxide and methane were the name of the game back then. CO2 is what makes our drinks fizz. But isn't the other gas dangerous? Yes, because you can't smell methane. And that's the reason there was no life on Earth billions of years ago. So how did we get from methane to oxygen? In come the cyanobacteria. This group of microbes started to evolve some 2.7 billion years ago. These tiny microbes mastered photosynthesis, converting sunlight into energy. And the byproduct of this process was, you've guessed it, oxygen. Soon it started escaping from water into the atmosphere. There, it reacted with methane, and over time, O2 replaced it completely. Scientists named this process the Great Oxidation Event. But how could it be bad? After all, we're alive thanks to it. All that oxygen acted as a poison for anaerobic organisms. And no, these are not life forms that didn't do aerobics or Pilates. The term simply means that these microorganisms didn't need oxygen to grow. Too much oxygen, and they would be goners. And that's precisely what happened. Scientists spoke of an oxygen overshoot that changed Earth's atmosphere for good. The disappearance of most anaerobic organisms was an early example of an extinction event. They didn't like the atmosphere at the time and decided to step down. But look on the bright side. They made room for oxygen-loving humans to enter the picture. Let's go to Turkey. No, not the seaside resorts that tourists visit in the summer, but the region of Anatolia in the southeast of the country. Göbekli Tepe is the world's oldest known temple site. It dates back to the Neolithic period. Scientists found a stone pillar here that tells a tale of an ancient disaster. They presume that the pillar is commemorative. Today, humans still build similar structures to mark an important event or a person. Just one example is the Washington Memorial. It was built in honor of the first American president, George Washington. But the pillar in Turkey doesn't commemorate a happy event. Scientists believe it shows a devastating occurrence, a comet crashing into the Earth. The event must have been destructive. There are also other signs on the monument. These symbols align with the setup of the night sky stars for the year 10,950 BCE. The date astounded the researchers. It matched their earlier research of an ice core sample in Greenland. This showed that a comet fragment hit our planet around the same time. The archaeological site could have easily been an ancient observatory. And whoever worked at it observed a cataclysmic event. The impact must have been so powerful that it changed the Earth's rotational axis. That's the imaginary pole going through our planet from top to bottom. That ancient comet must have packed a punch to knock the blue planet off balance. Have you heard of the city of Tal El Hammam in the valley of the Jordan River? The reason why your answer is probably no is that the city doesn't exist today. It completely disappeared around the year 1650 BCE. It was one of the 3 major cities in this part of the Middle East. Together, these 3 cities had a population bigger than Palm Springs today. At the time, Tal El Hammam was a metropolis. It even had high-rises, 5-story buildings constructed using mud bricks. But archaeologists found strange markings on them. The bricks melted as they were exposed to high temperatures. Yes, sound the fire alarm. Some sort of disaster had caused a major fire. Archaeological finds pointed to a suspect for such damage: a rock from space. So, where was the crater? This comet, or an asteroid, never made it to the ground. It was traveling at high speed, so it disintegrated before hitting the ground. Such an event is called an airburst. The largest witnessed meteor airburst happened over Tunguska in the north of Asia in 1908. Scientists estimated that the airburst in Tal El Hammam happened 2.5 miles above the city. This event released a lot of energy. Air temperature quickly rose to 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hot enough to set clothes and wood on fire in an instant. Mud bricks and tools made from metal start to melt when exposed to such heat. This would explain the evidence scientists unearthed. But there was one more find: salt. The event was so powerful that it distributed salt over the region around the Dead Sea. Any farmer will tell you that salty soil and crops don't go well together. People started moving away from the area because they couldn't grow food. Imagine an island with whitewashed villages surrounded by a sapphire blue sea. Such a place exists in reality. It's the island of Santorini. But the history of this place hides a tale of destruction. The island is of volcanic origin. This means that a violent eruption created it some 3,000 years ago. Now there are 2 islands. The bigger one is shaped like a horseshoe. When you look at them from above, the 2 islands look like they form a circle. That's because they were once a single island. It had a large mountain and was round in shape. But then it all changed almost overnight. One of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history tore Santorini apart. The earth trembled, tsunamis formed, and clouds of ash filled the sky. A daunting image. People felt the eruption hundreds of miles away. When it was all over, seawater rushed into the caldera of the former volcano. That's why the water in the lagoon has such a beautiful color. Scientists know so much about Santorini's past because of an unlikely assistant: a tree. The juniper tree, to be exact. People use its aromatic wood for everything from furniture to making pencils. On the Greek island, its rings revealed the tale of the ancient eruption. As a tree grows, it doesn't only go up, it expands sideways as well. Each new layer of bark adds a ring to the trunk. It takes a year for one ring to form. And on Santorini, one ring was unnaturally pale. The scientists did the math and voila, they dated the eruption to 1560 BCE.
Look at these bizarre bright patches on the surface of Ceres, a dwarf planet in the main asteroid belt between the orbits of Jupiter and Mars. Scientists have been wondering about the origin of these spots for a long time, and the mystery is finally solved. But first thing first, we must speak about NASA's Dawn mission. It was launched to give us up-close views of two celestial bodies, giant asteroid Vesta and dwarf planet Ceres. This spacecraft uses special ion engines, not regular chemical ones. They produce less power but can run for a long time, which makes Dawn faster over time without needing as much fuel. In 4 days, the engines can increase speed by about 60 miles per hour. By the time Dawn wrapped up its mission in October 2018, it was flying a mere 22 miles above the surface of Ceres, practically hugging the planet. Thanks to that, we got a few incredibly sharp images of these mysterious bright spots on Ceres. Even before Dawn arrived in 2015, telescopes had already spotted those shiny patches, but no one knew what they were. From orbit, Dawn snapped high-resolution images of those reflective areas, especially two bright ones inside Ocketer crater. After a lot of detective work, scientists figured out that those areas were mostly made up of sodium carbonate, a compound made of sodium, carbon, and oxygen. In other words, salt. But it wasn't just any old salt. It likely came from the liquid that had risen up from within Ceres and evaporated, leaving behind a shiny salt crust. And that's where things get exciting. Dawn got closer and closer to Ceres, which allowed astronomers to figure out that the liquid responsible for the bright patches came from an underground reservoir of brine or salty water. This briny reservoir is massive, stretching about 25 miles deep and hundreds of miles wide. And since Ceres isn't like icy moons orbiting big planets, where gravitational pull causes internal heating, it manages to keep liquid deep beneath its surface all by itself. One of the most intriguing areas of Ceres is Ocketer crater, a massive 57-mile wide depression that houses the brightest spots on the planet. This crater became one of the main goals of Dawn's extended mission. The spacecraft not only confirmed that these bright regions were young, some less than 2 million years old, but also found evidence that the geologic activity behind those spots could still be ongoing. The thing is, Dawn detected salt compounds in those bright areas, including sodium chloride, chemically bound with water and ammonium chloride. Now, salts with water in them tend to dehydrate really fast on the surface in just a few hundred years. But the salts on Ceres still had water in them, so the liquids must have reached the surface very recently. This discovery is proof that liquid is still flowing from deep inside Ceres up to the surface today. But how does this salty liquid make its way to the surface? Researchers have found two main ways it can happen. When the impact that formed Ocketer crater occurred about 20 million years ago, it melted a layer just beneath the surface. That slushy layer held a bunch of salts that gradually bubbled up to the surface. The impact heat subsided a few million years later, but large fractures left behind allowed briny liquids to continue seeping up to the surface from the deep underground reservoir. So even though the heat was long gone, the crater remained active because of those giant cracks. But Dawn didn't just find evidence of recent liquid activity through these bright patches. It also discovered something that looks a lot like Pingo's small, conical hills found in Earth's polar regions, formed by pressurized groundwater pushing up and freezing. Before, scientists have also seen Pingos on Mars, but spotting them on Ceres was a first for a dwarf planet. This is another clue that there's still liquid moving around under Ceres' surface. It means that Ceres is way more active than we thought. There's salty water beneath the surface and geologic activity that's most likely still happening. The mysterious bright spots, which are the result of liquid making its way up through fractures in the surface. And let's not forget about potential Pingos. It's clear that Ceres, even though it's just a dwarf planet, is a dynamic world, much like the icy moons we see elsewhere in the solar system. Venus is often called Earth's evil twin. The thing is, this world once started off quite similar to our home planet. But later, something went wrong. These days, the two planets are relatively close and similar in size. But Venus's atmosphere is very different from that on our planet, all thanks to a runaway greenhouse effect that has been going on for a long, long time. The surface of Venus can get even hotter than the surface of Mercury, 864 degrees F. And the surface pressure feels as if you're more than half a mile underwater. The thick atmosphere presents its own challenges. Its clouds consist of sulfuric acid, which is used in lead-acid batteries, as well as industrial cleaners. And if you decided to land on the planet, you'd have to survive atmospheric entry, with friction heating you up to 20,000 degrees F. Still, people have always wanted to explore this inhospitable world. And we can't but talk about the Venera program. During the 1970s and 1980s, several spacecraft studied Venus from orbit and from its hostile surface for an hour or so at a time. The 10 successful Venera landers provided us with most of the data we have today about the surface of this mysterious planet, including surface composition, direct measurements of atmospheric conditions, and sets of unique images. At the same time, astronomers got their hands on these treasures only after a series of annoying failures. They started with Venera 1, launched in February 1961. Each consequent spacecraft was somehow improved and upgraded. But it still wasn't until the 5th group of Venus-bound space probes launched in 1967 that one of them, Venera 4, reached its target and sent data from Venus. Before that, Venera 2 and 3, launched in November 1965, were supposed to land on Venus, but both of them failed in transit. 11-foot-tall Venera 4 was a hefty thing. Its bottom lander was a bunch of instruments and a battery wrapped up in a pressure shell equipped with a parachute. This probe reached Venus in October 1967 and successfully launched the lander. The mother spaceship sent the probe flying over the planet, and it entered Venus's atmosphere. Temperatures were reaching 20,000 degrees F, and the entry force was as great as 450 G. It didn't prevent the onboard instruments from analyzing the atmosphere and sending back data. The first recorded temperature was 102 degrees F, and atmospheric pressure was similar to that on Earth. But the deeper the probe went, the higher the numbers became. 10 atmospheres, 20. They kept going up much higher than engineers had anticipated. 93 minutes into the mission, when the probe was still more than 16 miles above the surface of the planet, Venera 4 cracked open near its top and crashed. At the crash point, the measurements showed 22 atmospheres and 530 degrees F. Scientists realized that they needed a bigger spaceship. After some intense engineering, Venera 5 and Venera 6 saw the light of the day. Engineers did everything they could to make the landing probe stronger, but they were pressed for time. That's why Venera 5 and 6 were not fully prepared when they went on a mission. That's why Venera 5 transmitted data for a mere 53 minutes before succumbing to temperatures of 600 degrees F and pressures of 27 atmospheres. And Venera 6 lasted for 51 minutes. In any case now, the leaders of the project knew what it would take. 840 degrees F, 100 atmospheres, corrosive acids. They seemed to be prepared. They found new materials to build the probe. They got a hotter and stronger test chamber for the trials. They modified the parachute to make the lander fall faster so that the probe could spend as much time on the surface as possible. The lander was also designed in the shape of an egg and made of titanium, so its surface was smooth and had just a few ports, welds, and substructures. The insides were lined with a shock absorber and insulation layer. The chamber was also to pre-chill to freezing temperatures before entry. And Venera 7 was finally a success. It reached the planet in December 1970, separated from the mothership, and went down into the atmosphere. The probe transmitted data for 35 minutes, and things seemed smooth. But then, its chute melted, and the probe dropped like a rock, hitting the ground at 35 miles per hour and bouncing. Then, a second after the landing, the signal was abruptly cut. It looked like the probe crashed to bits. Shockingly, a few months later, while looking through all the data they managed to get, engineers rediscovered the signal. It was super weak and lost amidst the noise. Apparently, when Venera 7 bounced, it misaligned the antenna. The probe rested on its side, which weakened the signal to 1 or 3% of its initial strength. The probe kept transmitting data for 23 minutes. After that, the temperatures got too high and melted its shell. Venera 8, launched in 1972, had a similar design and experienced a similar fate. Venera 9 and 10 were a new generation of probes. They could send back black and white photos. It was actually the probe's main goal, to send the first ever photographic panorama from another planet. Venera 9 and 10 were 5 times heavier than their predecessors and weighed 5 tons at launch. The lander was 6.5 feet tall. It was basically a hermetically sealed titanium sphere that was supposed to hold the instruments. It was bolted with gold wire seals. Inside, there were shelves of beryllium and electric fans, whose main goal was to disperse heat to prevent instrument failure. On the bottom of the lander, there was a shock-absorbing ring. And at the top, there was a titanium ring that looked like a hat. It served as an aero brake. The parachute was supposed to detach at 30 miles above the surface, and the aero brake had to do the rest. In October 1975, Venera 9 and 10 arrived at Venus and landed as planned. Venera 9 was the first to land. It touched down on a slight slope, a volcanic crater or a hill, and kicked quite a bit of dust while landing. One of its 2 cameras succeeded in photographing and transmitting data, and soon scientists saw the first ever pictures of the surface of Venus. It was mostly sharp rocks, soil, and a distant horizon. The sun was slightly obscured by clouds that day. A gentle breeze was blowing. Overall, it was a pleasant morning. If you didn't pay attention to crushing pressure, almost completely waterless atmosphere, insanely high temperatures, and corrosive acids. Venera 10 landed in the same way a few days later, but the terrain it landed on was much more boring. Just a rolling plain with hardened pieces of magma. Both probes transmitted for 40 to 60 minutes until their orbiters went out of range. When it happened, the temperatures inside the probes were reaching 140 degrees F. The orbiters later burned up in the atmosphere after completing their mission. Venera 11 and 12 could have been a success, but a mysterious electric anomaly messed up with their cameras, so their trip was quickly forgotten. And Venera 13 and 14 entered the picture. They had improved scientific instruments and cameras that could take color images, and new heat-resistant technologies were used during the creation of these probes. Venera 13 arrived first and landed as planned. It took 2 photos, one black and white and the other in color. In the photos, one could see a surface of pebbled, loose soil and outcroppings of bedrock. It all looked pretty similar to the surface of the ocean. In the distance, there were rolling plateaus and an orange sky. The images taken later by Venera 14 showed a more weathered plain with less loose soil and fine-grained rocks. The 2 probes also sent back what they heard. It mostly sounded like a gently blowing wind with hints of distant rumbling. Could be Venus quakes. Venera 13 and 14 were the last landers to touch the surface of the planet. Venera 15 and 16 just flew around Venus, mapping its topography from orbit.